This video was brought to you by Nebula. Labour are in a bit of a pickle at the moment. They came to power making some big commitments. During the campaign, they pledged to reverse Conservative austerity, ruled out basically any big tax rises, and said that they block more borrowing. Now this might sound appealing, but without tax rises, it's hard to see how they can find the billions of pounds they need to follow through on their promise to reverse austerity. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at how Reeves could fiddle with the fiscal rules to give herself a bit more room for manoeuvre, and whether the UK could ditch debt to GDP in its entirety, as, by the way, the IMF actually recommends. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with some context. Labour are currently stuck with what they describe as a £22 billion black hole. And there are basically three ways to resolve this: more borrowing, more taxes, or less spending. Unfortunately for Rachel Reeves, Labour have sort of ruled out all of these options. They've ruled out less spending by pledging not to return to austerity, and Reeves has recently reiterated her desire to increase investment spending. They ruled out most big tax increases in their manifesto, and while there are still some taxes they could raise, like capital gains or pension contributions, it's hard to see how they find £22 billion here. And they've ruled out more borrowing because they've committed to fiscal rules that are very similar to those that were outlined by Reeves's predecessor, Jeremy Hunt, in his so-called Charter for Budget Responsibility. For context, fiscal rules are set out by incumbent governments to demonstrate fiscal credibility and hopefully keep the bond markets happy and borrowing costs down. Now, every government since Tony Blair's in 1997 has set themselves some fiscal rules, and Labour today have two of them, which, at first glance, look to rule out any substantial increases in borrowing. According to the manifesto, the first is that day-to-day costs must be met by revenues so that the budget is in balance. And the second is a more long-term aspiration, namely that debt as a share of the economy, in other words, debt to GDP, must be falling by the fifth year of the forecast. Now, to be clear, when it comes to that second rule, it doesn't mean that Labour can borrow a whole load of money and say, oh no, don't worry, it will be fine in 5 years' time. Rather, it's whether or not the Office for Budget Responsibility, or OBR, thinks it's going to happen. Now, whether this is happening or not depends quite a lot on how you define debt. Here, you might be thinking, surely governments can't redefine debt, but that actually happens quite regularly. The current measure we use is a bit more expansive than the measure used by most European countries, but less expansive than the one we used to use, because in 2022, we stopped including bonds held by the Bank of England that the bank bought as part of quantitative easing. This is because, before quantitative easing, the bank held a negligible amount of government debt, so we thought it would be a good idea to include it as sort of part of the public sector. But after the financial crisis and the pandemic, it brought up debt representing nearly 10% of GDP, so we decided that it didn't really flatter us to include it anymore. So with this in mind, how could Reeves redefine debt to make things easier for her? Well, as we see it, there are three things she could do. First, she could fiddle with how we count the Bank of England's debt. Even just going back to that pre-2022 measure that included Bank of England debt will give her an extra £16 billion to spare. This is because, even though it would mean our debt to GDP ratio would be higher overall, the Bank of England is currently getting rid of lots of government debt, which makes it easier for the government to meet the aforementioned target, which is just about making sure debt is falling by year 5. Alternatively, she could exclude the money that we're currently paying to the Bank of England. Now, this is super complicated, and we're not going to go into too much detail about it now, but the TLDR is that the bank essentially makes a loss on all of the government debt it bought up to help the government after the financial crisis and the pandemic. The government therefore compensates the bank for these losses, to the tune of about £20 billion a year at the moment. Now, the government could just not count this in its debt calculations, or alternatively, it could just stop paying it altogether. This was actually proposed by Reform in their manifesto at the last election, but it's something that quite a lot of serious people also think is a good idea, although Labour don't look like they're massively keen on it. Another thing Labour could do is exclude public investment vehicles like the new GB Energy or National Wealth Fund and pre-existing policy banks like UK Export Finance, the British Business Bank and the UK Infrastructure Bank. Germany actually does something pretty similar. Germany's main fiscal rule, the so-called debt brake, limits borrowing to 0.35% of GDP in any year. But Germany gets around this by creating special funds for particular projects and excluding these from the federal budget. Anyway, in the UK's case, this could free up another £18 billion or so. The last and most drastic thing Labour could do, however, would be to just stop counting the UK's debt and instead start counting all of its assets and liabilities, as is the norm with most companies. This is something the IMF have actually been asking countries to do for a while now, and the Treasury already has two measures in place for this. The first is the public sector net financial liabilities, which is lovingly known as PSNUFL in the Treasury, and the second is public sector net worth. PSNUFL includes financial assets like student loans and equity stakes taken by public sector pension funds and investment vehicles. Say, for instance, GB Energy borrows £10 million to buy a stake in a solar panel company, and then it doubles in value. Debt to GDP would go up, but PSNUFL to GDP would go down, because PSNUFL would account for the rising value of that equity stake. Labour could go even further and use public sector net worth, which includes not just financial assets, but also physical assets, stuff like hospitals and land. Again, this measure has its advantages. It means you can't do silly things like sell off police stations for cheap in order to bring down your debt to GDP ratio, as the Conservatives did, because you're ignoring it as a physical asset. Anyway, this would free up an absurd amount of fiscal space for Reeves, about £65 billion, because both of them are expected to improve over the next 5 years, largely thanks to the way that student loans work. However, while these measures might make the 5-year forecast look a bit rosier and help Labour in the short term, one of the reasons that governments across the world have been hesitant to pick them up is they may make longer-term forecasts look pretty scary, largely because ageing populations mean that the government's pension liabilities are going to increase rapidly in the future. But if there's one country with even more of an incentive to drop debt to GDP ratio, it's the US, which currently has a debt to GDP ratio of well above 100% and a deficit on track to hit 7% of GDP in the coming years. And two candidates promising to spend trillions more if they win in November. And that's not even the wildest thing going on in the US right now, as we've been documenting in our slightly tongue-in-cheek series, WTF USA. Each week, we dive into the online discourse, explain the politics behind the stories, and tell you if you really need to pay attention. For example, in recent episodes, we've talked about Trump's foray into the world of crypto, claims of dog eating, and AI-generated Musk memes. These might sound stupid, but they actually tell us a lot about the candidate's economic plans, the state of post-truth politics, and how the US feels about its deficit. That is to say, WTF USA brings you the wildest moments from the 2024 election, tells you the hidden political meaning behind each of them, and then if you can just ignore the chaos, or if you should follow along. New videos come out every Friday only on Nebula. That's the streaming service we built alongside a bunch of our creator friends, and where you can find all kinds of superb content like WTF. We're super proud of WTF USA, and we hope that with your support, we'll be able to make other interesting, weird, and entertaining series with Nebula in the future. So signing up genuinely helps TLDR to grow and expand. As I say, it's not just WTF either. There's a whole bunch of other original content on the service, from creators like Real Life Law, Wendover Productions, and Neo. You can also watch every normal TLDR video ad-free on Nebula as well, and in some instances, before they land on YouTube. If you're not a member already, click the link in the description to get 40% off. That's just $30 for a year, or $2.50 a month. We really hope you check out the series, and as always, thanks for your support.